Hello and welcome to Postgres FM, a weekly show about all things PostgreSQL. I am Michael, founder of PG Mustard, and as usual I'm joined by Nick, founder of Postgres AI. Hey Nick, how's it going?
Hi Michael, everything is all right. My favorite topic today.
I was actually going to bring up an old joke and say it's the most boring one yet, but your idea now.
Yeah, it's my idea. It's like cold plunges. Sometimes you need to do it to feel. Then, like once we finish this recording, I will feel much better.
Yeah. Well, and also you mentioned some things to me. No spoilers, but I think you've got some ways of making this interesting, so I'm looking forward to those.
Who knows? Let's see. I wanted to talk about some kind of simple things. Of course, I'm pretty sure there are many people who know the topic much better than me. But I just wanted to raise some questions we currently have in Postgres and so on.
Yeah, me too. So, user management. Where do you want to start? Like, I think it might even be interesting to think about like the concept of roles in Postgres, because it's not.
Yeah.
I've come from a background of different databases, and Postgres was a little bit different when I came across it. I didn't really understand it until reading the docs exactly how things work.
First thing, if you run self-managed Postgres, first thing you confuse is operational system user and database user, right?
Yeah.
Second thing, you confuse users versus roles, because in other database systems they are distinguished. In Postgres, they are kind of the same thing. Like
third thing, groups as well.
Oh yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
There are no groups basically in Postgres, although they are like directly there are no separate concept. But let's answer all this. Like operational system user is operational system user, and Postgres user is Postgres user. Sometimes there is coincidence, and they both are named Postgres. For example, in Ubuntu. Yeah, and to make things more complex, if you locally connect using PSQL, and you don't specify uppercase U option, in this case, your current OS user will be used. Right. So it's okay, but we need to distinguish it. These things are very different, right? So yeah, coincidence makes things like I know like people who created it, they thought like let's make things simple.
Yeah.
But confusion which comes with it, I like if I, for example, needed to decide right now, I would probably not do this. Like just to avoid confusion, because the cost of confusion is much bigger than convenience you have.
Yeah, I think it's one of those. I think it's one of those things that depends who you're trying to optimize for. Are we trying to optimize for a developer at university learning computer science for the first time, just trying to get set up on a local machine and get up and running easily? I think, for example, in the Stack Overflow survey they do each year, there are several questions that if you optimized for that and that alone, you'd score highly in certain things. But sometimes you would make some design decisions if you are optimizing for that user that wouldn't be good for people trying to set it up at a company in a more secure manner with lots of different users that have different needs, maybe behind a firewall, in a way that's very, very different to that individual user trying to get set up for a little hobby project or just to learn about databases. So I think it's really hard to make a system that's optimal for both. And I'm not sure. I think probably we're at the stage where Postgres should be optimizing more for the secure case, but I could understand if it chose to go more along the lines of make it easy to get started.
Yeah, good points. And anyway, I just taught myself to use to distinguish when in my language I just try to mention explicitly OS user, DB user, so people who are listening understand very quickly what I'm trying to say. And this, I think, is a good mitigation of this to avoid confusion. Just OS user, DB user, that's it. Although if you say role, people also maybe won't think about OS user, because we don't use role there at all, right? So so this is another way you can, but still, like If you say user, probably it's the user. So, yeah, and the second confusion, and I think third confusion is similar here, right? So users are and roles, it's the same in Postgres, and groups also like basically the same. So it's just one single database object basically, right? And you can create a role or user Michael and then grant it to user or role Nik, right? So I will get all permissions you have, and in this case, this will make you like virtually database group Michael, right? So this it's very flexible, but also might be confusing, especially for those who came from other database management systems.
For sure. I pulled out a good line from the docs which says any role can act as a user, as a group, or both, which I thought was a nice succinct way of saying the groups can still act as users individually, but they can also be groups of permissions. And Nik and Michael could both be DBA in the DBA's group, but also have other memberships to other groups, and it makes it easier to manage permissions that way, right?
Yeah, good. So these are kind of basic things, and I wanted to discuss like I never heard anyone saying Postgres is having so beautiful privileges system. Somehow it's like I've heard opposite a lot of times, especially from guys who manage operational system and they need to manage Postgres, like sysadmins and then later SREs. They always complain, always. And when they start complaining, I don't listen. I just say, have you learned about default privileges?
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, just this first thing you need to remember. There are default privileges, and you can alter them and say like these default privileges that should be always assigned, right? This makes things easier, much easier. Because if you have a lot of database objects, like you think, I'm going to create new role, user group, how am I going to or tomorrow developers will create new table, and who will take care of handling permissions, privileges, right? So default privileges help, right? And still common mistakes are forgetting some interesting privileges like the connection to database or usage for schema, and it's impossible to avoid these mistakes. Impossible. Like last week, I remember we spent 15 minutes trying to understand why it's not working. Our monitoring was not working, and then we realized, okay, it's not monitoring, but something was wrong, and we realized that it was not usual setup, and we just forgot about usage permission to some schema. That's it. It's
interesting.
It's always going to happen, always. So here my advice: don't blame yourself. like it's common. Yeah, that's it.
And read the error messages. Did you get a good message back?
No.
Oh, interesting.
Lack of permissions. That's it. Like you cannot do something. You cannot read from some table, but it won't tell you that it's because of lack of permissions for schema. So it's tricky sometimes. You need to brainstorm ideas, and then you find it. Yeah, it was a view, I think. Yeah. So these are kind of common roadblocks you can experience, right?
Yeah. So you've kind of you've gone down what roles have permissions to read and write to different tables, for example, or views or schemas. But we also have the challenge of ownership that's also tied in with users. Yes. And is that worth touching on a little bit?
Yeah, owner to, owned by. You remember the sequences can be owned by table, but it's very completely different thing. But every object can have owner in terms of role, right? Yeah. So there are two ownership things, but this is all just some specific thing for sequences. It's very, very specific for sequences. Yeah, so objects can belong to. And here I when people start complaining, I ask same thing. I ask, have you learned about altering, passing all ownership from one user to another, grant blah 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 owned by or something like this? There is such ability. I don't remember syntax, but you can say I have a lot of stuff. I'm going to quit this company, you know, and I give it to you. Yeah.
I think, is it something like reassigned owned by?
Yeah, something like this.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, I like these massive operations. Obviously, folks who developed them suffered enough, so they developed it. And this is great to have massive operations. It helps.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think actually I made a mistake in this sequence of like things to mention. First thing I would mention is that separating roles, like separating pieces of application, kinds of workload to multiple roles and groups and so on, and having some approach, it's good, much better than having just single super user and that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or just single application user and that's it. Because in many aspects, so we should separate because this gives us control and also troubleshooting capabilities. Because, you know, PGStar statements has a username or use ID. I don't remember exactly. It tracks workload separately for each user, which is good.
Yeah, true. So it's useful for troubleshooting, but also I think it helps protect you from yourself sometimes. If you know you only should be reading data, connecting as a read-only user helps you feel safe, and that's true at the application level as well, right? If it shouldn't be creating objects, if it should just be doing normal kind of CRUD operations, being a normal application user makes sense. But if maybe you're doing migrations or creating objects, as we were just talking about, having an application admin role separately from an application user role makes a lot of sense.
In terms of security, right?
Well, so security I think is part of it, but I think also just protection from yourself, like from mistakes as well, right? If an application user shouldn't be created, like, yeah, probably mostly security, but I think there's also an element of not allowing read-only users to drop data, like by mistake.
Yeah. So it's typical divide and conquer approach. So you divide and you have better control and visibility, like transparency of what's happening. And now I'm talking about this, and speaking of transparency, observability-wise, I think it makes sense actually to extend query analysis we discussed so many times and have in monitoring. I know guys who are developing our monitoring, they are watching this podcast, listening to it. So I think it's a good idea actually to have separate graphs aggregated by user from PGStar statements and also by database. So just like another kinds of aggregation PGStar statements offers, why not using them, right? So like I never saw such graphs implemented. Maybe there are some in some monitoring systems, but I think it's quite useful, and you can understand, for example, how much time database time is spent every second. My favorite seconds per second per each user, right? So and this helps you understand, like, if your application and parts of workloads are split between multiple users, you can track and see which user generates more load at any given moment, right? Or maybe more I/O in terms of hits and reads to buffer pool. Or generating a lot of temporary files. So it's like all the metrics are here, and this is just dimension you can use to aggregate and see who to blame, which part of application to blame or workload to blame, right?
Yeah, that's a good point actually. And since you mentioned temporary files, that is one use case I've seen from the performance side for roles is you can set, for example, work mem at the role level, so you could give.
This I wanted to touch. Yes.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember. I once confessed that I put some big system down, not noticing.
No, I don't remember.
Yeah. There was a story when it was a big loss in terms of income. It was e-commerce, and I just haven't noticed that your users had user level settings. And it was not WorkMem. WorkMem is a good idea, I think, but it was logging settings.
I think I remember
Log mean duration statement. So yeah, So something like I don't remember exactly, but I just thought, oh, it's great. Like let's change some level of verbosity, and then I didn't recognize that main user which is used for application. It was a single main user at that time. It has specific settings, so colliding to my change, we had observer effect, and everything went down. So this increases complexity every time you have it. We also had a case, for example, when we decided to, in PG Bouncer, you can configure it in terms of pool sizes and combination of database and user. You can allocate a number of connections, maximum number of connections, and so on. And if you start splitting like your quotas, you, for example, have max connections 500, right? Big server, almost 200 cores, for example, 360 cores, and you have like 600 max connections, which is very, very sane. Not far from max connections, cool. You are not allowing a lot of idle connections. And then you think, okay, I'm going to split and have boundaries of quotas for each user. And at that case, we ended up getting rid of it after a year or two of trying to use it, because it just amplifies complexity like everywhere. You need to think about like oh, this but we have users. So this is good, very sharp fine-tuning method. And in case of workmem, I think you're right. It's better to increase workmem for specific like reporting roles than globally. But if you go in this direction too far, it's similar to tuning tables or to vacuum tuning per table. I don't like it, because in growing organization, when we need to change things all the time, complexity of configuration, it bites back very badly after like few months. Everyone already forgot about this, and you have so complex fine-tuned system. I would first consider like global changes wherever it's possible. Where maybe workmem is kind of some exclusion, but connections and all the settings, it's better to have common rules for everyone, because per role, it's like exclusions from global rule, right?
And harder to look up, right? Like easy to forget. I think you make such a good point here. Even workmem, you might be able to get away with it without setting it at the role level. Like, could you set it for each reporting query? If you only run a very few number of reporting queries, you could set it just in the session, for example.
Yeah.
With caveats again around poolers, but yeah.
Yeah, I actually, PG Bouncer is one thing, but create role itself, create user in Postgres itself has also connection limit option. And this is the way where you can maybe if in some cases it's good, like we know these users should be very limited, we know they're abusers, connection limit 3, that's it. So that's it. But in general, I don't like too many local rules, because the complexity grows a lot. I wanted to emphasize once again for like importance of separation of roles, not only for application parts or workload parts, but also for humans. Especially in AI time we live in, like some humans can be sometimes bots, like AI, LLMs also. Sometimes they are actually humans, and if everyone shares just one role, especially if it's super user, that's dangerous, right? And we cannot understand who is like even not only about like who is like can put us down, but for example, during incidents, it's harder to trace who is connected. We can do it using process ID and then go and check at OS level, but sometimes if they are root there, then we need to trace. It's a lot. Sometimes it's RDS, we don't have access to OS, and so if everyone is connected using one role, we cannot understand like who is doing what. And that's not good. That's like complicates troubleshooting a lot. So separation here again is very, very, very good practice, right?
Yeah. Plus all the security implications, right? Like you never want to think about what if someone that has super user access leaves the company all of a sudden. Like there's all sorts of risks to the more people that have that, let's say it's password, like username password, just the more threat like more.
It's And if it's one user for all, password rotation becomes like terrible. And I know cases, right? So, and yes, and it's interesting that create role. This is probably for guys who want to create their first patch or something, and maybe it's a good idea to think as a good proposal for what Postgres lacks. So there is, create role has expiration. You can specify when
I didn't know that.
Yeah, some valid until or something like this. So you can specify when. I never used it. I just think this is good actually. So you can have temporary access. But I would rather prefer seeing expiration for password only. So rotation will become mandatory, and maybe with some warning which will start popping up in logs and to client messages like 1 month before, for example.
Yeah. I'm not such a big fan. I haven't really thought it through for databases, but I'm not a fan of password rotation policies for like individual web apps that you log into, for example. I just don't think it adds much. But yeah.
Why do you think so?
So I think the root issue is password reuse. So like I think the main thing you're protecting yourself from is a different service getting hacked and them not storing passwords hashed, like maybe plain text passwords, or maybe a weak hashing algorithm and it gets cracked, and then people try and use the same password in lots of different services and they happen to get lucky with your service. And if you rotate passwords, then they have to do that within a set period of time. Otherwise, you have to have set a new password. So I think it has some protection there. But I'd much rather focus on just educating people to use unique passwords so you don't have that vector.
But imagine there's an organization, many people working, like new people come, some people leave the company, and there is some passwords shared among them, and it haven't been changed for years.
Yeah.
Is it a good idea? Or one user every user have their own password, but some users work at company many years. They created a lot of automation and so on, and maybe there are service roles, right, like for automation, and some of them also like already propagated to many pieces of code. I don't know, like passwords should not be stored in code, right? Of course, but there are several pieces of automation sharing the same password, and it was not changed for years. Doesn't feel safe. And this, I'm not a security expert. I just know sometimes there is a policy for password rotation, token rotation, expiration, and so on. There is such policy. Yeah. But Postgres lacks this. So it should be managed outside of Postgres and enforced outside.
It's also a bit of a pain to do. Like, in terms of like back to zero downtime, right? Like we have to... If we want to rotate the
Yes, I think like usually you will end up having new role, but then it won't work everywhere because of ownership as well. So exactly like thinking through. Okay, maybe not only expiration, but maybe some workflow when, for example, 2 passwords are temporarily allowed for some time, and then
that would be great.
You can still use the same role because you have a lot of nodes, application nodes, and some other things which constantly working with this database, right? So you need some overlapping for both passwords, for example. Or another thing, actually, maybe we will agree both here. It would be good to say, simple passwords are not allowed.
Yes. I completely agree.
Right? Or there is. Maybe I'm missing something because I'm old.
No, the only thing I know of in this area is quite a cool service by an Australian guy called Troy Hunt. I might have mentioned it in the past. He runs a website called Have I Been Pwned, but he also runs a service.
I know this website actually.
Yeah, it's great. So that website is you can put your email address in, and the website will tell you, are you in any dumps of email address password combos from
it creates one more dump every time, and it always say yes. No?
Basically, the answer is always yes. Yeah, but you can see which services, for example.
I'm joking. Yeah.
Well, and another service he runs is basically all of those passwords. So if like one of your users sets a password, you can hash it, send it off to his service, and say, is this one in the leaked database? And all of the simple passwords are, like,
Of course.
every single simple password you can ever imagine is in there, plus any that have been leaked. So you can not only stop people setting simple passwords, but you can also stop them setting ones that have already been leaked. So it's, well, at least publicly known and leaked.
Yeah.
So that's a cool service, but obviously it's a like web service.
That's why people prefer auto-generated passwords lately. Like just not rely on the users anymore at all. Just always auto-generate. That's it.
Do you mean like using a password manager, or do you mean like
in general, instead of like you build some system and instead of saying like you will generate it, you will provide a password, no, just auto-generate it. But again, there is no, for example, feature to ask user to change it. Like there are some things usually some systems have, but database system doesn't, right? So there is like you need some layer here above. But Postgres could have some of these things. It recently got another thing which we discussed last week, right? The way to use OAuth, how to pronounce it.
Oh yeah. Oh, I say OAuth, but I actually don't know if I've heard anyone say it.
Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. But there are more like fundamental things that could be also implemented. Just there is opportunity here. Okay. Anyway, we both agree that simple passwords are bad, and Postgres could check them when role is created or password changed using alter role. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know.
And we could implement, like, everybody on their own could implement their own kind of like interface and
functional. I think it's possible with event triggers, maybe, right? I don't know. Actually, I don't know.
I was actually thinking just a little simple web app, but yeah.
Well, on top of Postgres, of course, but inside Postgres, I think if it was a feature, it would be good to have it implemented in a way that it could be customized. You provide a function which just returns true or false. That's it. It would be good. And then you have some policy to be defined. Speaking of passwords and leaking passwords, of course, we know like plain text passwords is bad, right? Encrypted. They should be encrypted and stored in hash. Yeah. And many years MD5 was the choice, right? And in PGHBA-conf you configure that like no trust, no plain text, just MD5, right? But since Postgres 10 we have Scram, which is like salted. Well, MD5 actually was also salted with username. You know this, right? So we always could create, when you say create user, you could specify not the plain text password in the DDL command, but you could concatenate password, your actual password you want to have, and username, and then calculate MD5 of it, and then have prefix MD5 and provide all this instead of password. And this will work properly. Yeah, so this protects you from password leaking to, like, just leaking password, right? Because, for example, we always say log statement should be DDL. So we see what's happening, right? But if it's DDL, then every create user or alter user changing password, it leaks that value, which is not good.
And it means anybody with access to the logs.
Yeah. In big organization, we have a log collecting system and so on.
True.
Of course, usually there are some mechanisms to remove PII and so on, but this is not just PII. It's like, it's very, very, very dangerous PII, right? And yeah, so actually, so plain text is absolutely no, like as algorithm to store passwords, because also it will go to dumps. Well, regular dump don't dump users and rows, right? But pgdump all does. Pgdump all does. I'm not sure if it works on RDS though and others, but in self-managed definitely it works, and it will dump everything, including this. Okay, so this is good idea to have like this like hash instead of password to provide it, and even if it goes to logs, it's already like not the raw value, which is much better, right? And Scrum adds even better protection because still MD5 you can basically find collisions with regular hardware these days, right? So Scrum it's much better and much more stronger encrypted and so on. But still, like when I see people use like even if Scrum is configured everything, creating user is a problem because it goes to logs. Especially if it's MD5, people still use plain text to create user, and if log statement is DDL, it will go with plain text to logs. And to avoid that, how can we avoid that? Well, changing log statement is not a good idea because you will miss the fact. I would prefer seeing that this user was created but do not see password.
Yeah.
And I actually expected PG Audit would do this, but no. It also leaks
interesting.
password. Yeah. And I know like PG Audit was developed by Crunchy. Crunchy in terms of security is great. By the way, there is a document. Maybe we mentioned, I don't remember, this document created.
We did a whole episode on auditing, so it came up then.
So there is a public document developed, I think, during their like contract with US military, right? So it was great. A huge list of checks you should do to improve security. And I checked Crunchy Breach. I was thinking, okay, like how do they do it? Well, they log it twice. And if you create a role using plain text password, it's logged twice as plain text. So that's disappointing, actually, right? So and PG Audit will log it as plain text as well. Why? Because it logs the statement as like context. This is a problem. PG Audit says the role was created, but then it also logs context, and context exposes password if it was not hash value but plain text. And I just recalled we did it like a couple of weeks ago. We were curious, and it was needed for some work. And I recalled like many years ago, I created like basic like PLPGSQL scripts, which will auto-generate password. You just specify length, and it will auto-generate. Mm-hmm. It will be printed but not logged. Yeah, so it's quite easy. Like you just do anonymous do block, and that's it. Or you can wrap it inside function, right? In case of context, the function name will be mentioned, right? But not the body of it.
Yeah, I'm missing something. How come it avoids being logged?
So if you, for example, wrap it inside PLPGSQL function, its name will be logged, but not the body. That's it. That's it. So you just create PLPGSQL function, create or alter user, and work through it. And even if you will do plain text, like for simplicity, convenience, it won't go to logs.
Yeah.
Well, it will. Because again, combining idea. In my case, the password is auto-generated and just printed out, so you can start using it. Yeah.
What about other let's say it takes for some reason you hit some lock or something, and it takes more than 50 milliseconds or whatever you've set statement time at. Not like log statement to. If it's in a function, it won't get logged there either, or it might. Would it? No, it wouldn't, because it wouldn't be in the query. Nice.
Yeah. So function name will be logged. Password is auto-generated inside. It's printed to you, but it's not
great. Yeah. Not logged in anywhere. Great.
Yeah, but it's like you. This is it should be like kind of code style or something, and you need to enforce it yourself. Database won't enforce it. This is what I think. There's a gap here we could fill. Just improving Postgres itself, just to have some protection that good practices are followed, right? Right now it's just on shoulders of who manages Postgres.
I actually can't think of any good reason to log the actual password in plain text ever.
Exactly.
So, like what? Yeah, we might be better. That could just be changed,
simple change. Yeah. Just mask it. Yeah. Why?
Well, yeah. Just
even
don't put
doesn't matter. Is it a hash or just password itself? Just mask it.
Star. No, doesn't matter. Yeah.
Exactly. One more thing I think is like kind of interesting I learned recently. I haven't checked myself, but I rely on what my team tells me. We develop components for self-driving Postgres, right?
Yeah.
And one of them is to deal with index health, which we discussed many times.
Yeah.
So we needed to be able to recreate indexes, and we started with dblink, which was not good because password is always there. When you connect, you need to specify password. I recall the old trick I learned like many years ago, but then I recently saw it's actually described in documentation of dblink connect function. You can use Postgres FDW server, and on top of it, you can use dblink. In this case, dblink connect will not need to have password because password is defined in FDW, right? So in user mapping, actually. In foreign server, you define just like IP address and give it a name, but then you define user mapping, and there you need to provide password. So the thing is that if you create a dump, this thing will be dumped, like user mapping will be dumped, right? And password is there, right? So also like kind of like things which should be maybe understood better and maybe adjusted. So it's already better. I mean, your code doesn't need to specify password. It's just one definition, that's it. But if you work with dumps too much, this is a place where password can be leaked. Yeah. And you probably don't expect it also. I think people don't expect password to be leaked in dumps. So yeah, these are interesting things about passwords and user management. Right now we should make efforts to be protected. This is the key.
Yeah.
And also let me complain a little bit. The problem is if people often call us to check things, we come and it's actually not easy to understand kind of like what's happening with, for example, user management and passwords. We can see the list of roles and so on, but to understand the risks and the problems, we need to talk to people right now. So the automated solutions to perform security audit, they are usually quite weak, unfortunately, because of it's not easy. It's not easy to understand that, for example, passwords is going to be leaked next week because of something.
Yeah. On kind of password protection front, I don't think we mentioned it last week, but I spotted in the release notes that MD5 is actually being deprecated as part of 18.
Yeah.
So not removed yet, but you get deprecation warnings now if you in Postgres 18 if you try.
It took 8 years. Scam was added in Postgres 10, so it's 10 and 8 or 9 years depending on how you count. So
but progress, good news.
Good, yeah. So everyone should be using Scam and think about things we just discussed, and it will be much better. But right now there are many dangers in terms of security, unfortunately. And I think it's also a job for managed platform to improve things, right? And I think they do. I saw many things, and they recognize this problem.
I think they just take a lot of this out of they handle that stuff. If you've got a good provider that's hot on security stuff, then you're probably at least got the absolute basics.
Certificates and TLS.
Yeah,
this is also
good point.
Yeah, also important.
Slightly outside the scope of user management, but definitely security 101, right?
Adjacent topic.
Yeah. Another time.
Right. So these are things I wanted to touch a little bit. What else? That's it.
I think that's good. Yeah. Thanks so much, Nikolai. Catch you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.